Hey everyone, my name is Rooster and welcome back to Mechabellum. And welcome to the very first video in this three-part series on unit positioning. This series will guide you through the three main playstyles I believe there are in this game, being standard, aggro, and defense. The series will go through each one of these playstyles in order, and you will be able to understand better what each playstyle is trying to achieve, I think, by going through it in this particular order. So today we start with standard. What is standard to begin with? It is a playstyle where you position most of your units around the towers. So there is usually going to be quite a big gap here between you and your opponent's units, and you are playing for the long range battle. Now, let's go over to our side of the board and start with some of the basics. So in Mechabellum, there are basically three things that you have to always think about. The first is your chaff, right? The small units that are trying to distract from your bigger and important units. Then two is going to be chaff clear, right? Your opponent is going to have small units as well. And in order for your important units, your single target DPS, to connect, you will need to chaff clear and efficiently get rid of all of these small units. And then third, I've mentioned it, is going to be your single target DPS, the units that will be capable of dealing with the opponent's big units, the single targets, the tanky guys. Now, let's start with our chaff, right? Where do we want our chaff to be positioned? When you're playing in standard, and especially when the game starts out, you're relatively low on resources, right? You don't have that many deployments, you don't have that much money. So you have to be somewhat efficient in your early engagements to be able to win a fight. What this means is that, generally speaking, you'll be wanting to fight on two fronts, right? Ideally, you will want to protect your towers, since these will give you a long debuff if they do get taken. So it makes sense to try and position around those, protect those, and then immediately also make that the focus point of where you would like the fight to be, since you don't have the deployments to play everywhere on the field at once. So what you want is for your opponent's units to all basically advance in this way towards your towers, right? What you don't want to happen is for your opponent's units to move like this, because this becomes very hard for your chaff clear units, the units to have splash on their auto attacks, to deal with all the enemy crawlers and fangs. If they excuse me, if all the fangs and crawlers start to move about and split up, it's going to take much longer for you to take out the chaff, and therefore it's also going to be much harder for you to actually connect with the important units. Let's say those are the opponent's sledges here. So how do you make this happen? Well, what you need is a funnel, right? Now, a funnel is basically the way that the enemy units will choose their target. They generally will advance to whatever is closest to them. So what you would want is basically something that moves right here in front of all of your other units. Now, in standard, because there is a lot of space between you and your opponent, you don't have to care too much about the first 5 to 10 seconds of combat, because you're not under a direct threat. Your towers aren't under a direct threat because your opponent starts in the back as well, so there is some travel time that you have to take into account. This means that you don't need to put stuff all the way in front of your tower. What will suffice, usually, is to have something like just a couple crawlers sitting behind the tower like so, and what this will do is that these will, in the first 5 to 10 seconds of combat, pass your tower, and because they are so much faster than most of your other units on the board, it will mean that they are the focal point for your opponent's units to go towards. And this will usually have good enough of a funnel effect and effectively draw in all of the opponent's units towards this point right here. Now, With that being said, you of course want chaff layers. For those of you that have seen my previous video on positioning, this means that you want layers of chaff to keep running in as the fight progresses, because the initial wave is going to get taken out, right? As soon as it hits or gets in range of your opponent's units, they will try and take it out. So what you want is for some crawlers to come in first, the ones that generally will be behind your tower, and then you will want a second wave. These will usually be all the way in the back, like you can see here. So what you would want then is, let's see, you would want some crawlers right here and right here, and then the same thing as well on the other side of the field, right? You will see this on the opponent's board here as well. The reason why there is 3 gaps here, so 3 squares between the flank and the crawlers, is to make sure that you could potentially put something like a rhino in between in case your opponent wants to create a pull and, well, pull away all of your chaff units. Now, with chaff, or at least crawlers done, you can start thinking about something like fangs, right? But again, because you're playing standard, you don't care too much about having stuff here in front. It's very nice to have fangs because they're much slower than crawlers, and so you will want some of them in the mix as well, because they will be your, say, your 3rd and your 4th wave of chaff, right? We have the first wave of chaff, the crawlers, then the second wave of delayed crawlers because they're fast, and then we basically have the 3rd wave of chaff, which are these initial fangs, and we can even have something like a 4th wave or even 5th wave of chaff units running in. That is usually chaff. So what I generally don't want to see in the early game is for people to have a bunch of fangs and position them all the way in front, especially positioning like multiple fangs right here. This is very unnecessary, because they're not really protecting anything most of the time. Again, like, your opponent is usually too far away from you to be able to instantly engage your important units. So you can just let your chaff that is behind the tower protect them by getting in front of them and making use of those initial seconds where nothing really is happening. What this will do is create the exact problem we're trying to mitigate, at least in the early to mid game, right? We don't want to have 4, 5 different attack fronts, because that will mean that we need 4 or 5 dedicated chaff clear units with dedicated single target DPS to fight on those fronts, right? What this is creating is you're now creating 4 funnels here, because these are all equidistant, and this crawler will want to split up and go as well to the left and to the right. The arrow here is not showing it. There we go. So what this will do is just create a split for your opponent, which is something that they kind of want to happen, and is one of the reasons why they position it behind the tower like this. So generally speaking, I would recommend not trying to go for something like this unless it is very necessary and you see that your opponent is getting insta-locks on your important units. So with the chaff out of the way, we move on to the chaff clear, as well as the single target DPS. So where do you position your important units? Here I want to work with a notion of base range of units, and then I will show you guys basically the zone of deployment for said units depending on their base range. Of course, you have to think about where you want to position units relative to what their job is supposed to be, right? So if here your first point of contact is going to be in front of the tower, it would be quite nice for there to be a chaff clear unit right in front of your tower as well, because it will be able to deal with all the incoming chaff that is now converging towards your tower. So do think about that when you're positioning. At the end of this video, I'll show you guys some setups you might be working towards and playing standard, and you'll see kind of where the chaff clear units are positioned. What I would like to work with here is a deployment zone. Now, where exactly does that the first deployment zone sit? It sits right here in front of the tower. Basically, the first 2 to 4 squares, and the units you will want to put here are going to be the units that have a base range of 100 or less. And Stormcallers, things that have 180 base range or more, can also sit here because they will be so long range that they basically don't move at all. And so they will be safe throughout the entire round anyway. Keep in mind as well that the units you will want here are, yes, 100 base range or less, and also somewhere around 9 meters a second or less, right? So we want slower units. The fast units will go a bit further behind the tower, as I will be getting to in a bit. So which units will you want to see here? You would want to see things like arc lights, sledges, stormcallers I've mentioned, things like Vulcans. If you're playing fortresses, that's where you want them. Scorpions will be there. That's basically most of the units you will be putting here. Badgers can also go here if you happen to have them. They are a bit of a faster unit, so you could also sometimes put them a bit further back to account for their speed, but generally speaking, these are the units you would want to see in this deployment zone. That leads us to a second deployment zone, which is going to be the deployment zone for units with a base range of 100 or more and a speed of also at least less than 10 meters a second. The units I'm thinking of here specifically are going to be things like melting points and marksmen. Now, the melting points and the marksmen, where do you want them? You will want them to sit around here. They are going to be sitting behind that line of your first deployment, of your first category of units, things like your tanks and your Vulcans, because they have slightly longer range. And so you don't want clumping up to happen, and they will be safe enough and sit behind your tanks and your chaff clear at a good enough range. Then there is a third deployment zone that is somewhat important. This is the deployment zone that you will be using for the units that have, basically here, the only important thing is going to be their speed. So this is going to be the units that have a base speed of 16 meters a second. Maybe if more units are added, it could also be anything above 10 meters a second though, but currently we don't have that many units that sit between 10 meters a second and 60 meters a second. So for now, you can just think of all 60 meters a second units that aren't crawlers will be sitting in this deployment zone, and that deployment zone is going to be this area right here. The units you will see there are going to be things like Mustangs, like Phoenixes, like Farseer, like Steel Balls, if you're playing those in Standard. These will all be sitting back here. Because of their high movement speed, you have to account for the way that the fight is going to progress, especially after the first 10 to 15 seconds are over. You want to make sure that there is good coordination between your fast units and your slower units, and make sure that there is no situation where either one of them gets taken out before the other because there is simply a mismatch in their timings. So this is generally the area that you will want to think about, right? Again, blue area right up there is going to be 100 meter base range or less, and less than 10 meters a second movement speed. The pink area in the middle is going to be units with more than 100 meter base range and less than 10 meters a second speed, so things like your marksmen and your melters. And then the yellow zone will be any unit that has 16 meters a second movement speed. Of course, apart from crawlers, we talked about those earlier, those are your chaff. They have dedicated positions for chaff. That pretty much covers all of the areas that you should know about. One final thing that I haven't mentioned and that is being shown here on the screen is these distraction crawlers. These are usually being used to distract things like stormcallers and make sure that their initial first or even their first 2 salvos miss important targets and go towards these crawlers. Because of their travel time, they will miss, and it means that you can at least make sure your opponent doesn't get an immediate valuable lock on some of your units. What you have to keep in mind here, one, they are always vertically positioned. The reason for this is that this can't be fully missiled. If your opponent decides to missile this, the 3 crawlers all the way at the back are always going to live, and so you will still get some value out of this beacon. And then 2, you have to keep in mind that this will create a funnel as well, because now this is your most forward placed unit. If I put a crawler here, suddenly it's no longer going to be these 2 crawlers that are going to create the funnels. It is going to be this pack of crawlers. So this pack of crawlers is going to move, let's say, from the right to the left, and it's going to be pulling, especially these fast chaff units, the crawlers, towards it. When you do this, keep in mind what the opponent units are doing. If you are pulling this into your backline, make sure that you have some chaff clear units that are able to deal with opponent chaff converging towards the middle, right? You can't be playing on, let's say, the outsides first and only have chaff clear units there and be fine because all you were using were these crawlers here behind your towers, and then suddenly use a mobile beacon here that draws in and changes the funnels to go towards the middle. Now what you would need is at least to have some chaff clear units that are sitting here or here or here to be able to deal with all of the incoming chaff that you just pulled towards the middle. Keep this in mind. With that being said, I think that that is all I wanted to get through for when it comes to standard. Again, this isn't the absolute like be all and end all of standard gameplay. This is just a template that I like to use in my games, and that works very well up to the extremely high MMRs. People have preferences, people have playstyles that work for them, so you can experiment a bit, put some things a bit further back or a bit further forward, try and see what you like, but I'm here trying to give you a template for success if you're just starting out and you're a bit bewildered as to where your units have to go. Experiment with this though, try and have some fun. I'm not giving you like absolutely always build this comp, absolutely always do this, but I'm giving you a bit of a template so that if you want to try and play a certain unit, you will at least know where to place it when you are facing an opponent that is also playing standard into you. Keep this in mind. If your opponent is playing something different, then you will have to be going to my other videos, or if you want to play aggressive, please keep in mind that this does not apply to that, right? This is a positioning guide specifically for standard games where both you and your opponent are playing around your towers and are going for that long-range game and have a bunch of empty space in the middle of the battlefield. Either way, if you liked this video, please leave a thumbs up. Let me know what you think about this. Do you have different opinions? Did I miss anything? Do you have any questions? I will try and respond as best I can. Go and check me out on Twitch if you want to see me play live. And with that being said, please take care and see you in the next video. Bye-bye.